Hello, and welcome to Edupedia World. Today we are going to cover the subject ethics, justice, and fair treatment in HR management. So for many managers, recruitment and placement, training and development, and compensation are the heart of human resource management. But people expect something more. They expect their employers to treat them fairly and to have a safe work environment. So the main purpose of this chapter is to explain ethics, justice, and fair treatment in human resource management, matters essential for positive employee relations. So topics include ethics and fair treatment at work, factors that shape ethical behavior at work, and managers' roles in fostering improved workplace ethics, and employee discipline and dismissals. Now, people face ethical choices every day. Now, is it wrong to use a company credit card for personal purchases? Or is a rupees 1,000 gift card to a client unacceptable? So, we should start by asking why include ethics in a human resource management book. So, for two reasons. First, ethics is not theoretical. Instead, it greases the wheels that make businesses work. And managers who promise raises but don't deliver, salespeople who say the order is coming when it's not, production managers who take kickbacks from suppliers, they all corrode the trust that day-to-day business transactions depend on and eventually run the businesses into the ground. Now, many Indian firms have developed their own code of ethics. And to name a few, Infosys, Delhi Metro Rail Corporation, and Tata Group are known for their firm's commitment to business ethics. In general, experts point out that ethical concerns in business and other walks of life are being discussed more publicly in India since the 1990s, after India's integration with the global economy became stronger. And the Indian trend is also to place the blame on the system, which some experts think is not the right approach. So, what do we mean by ethics? Ethics refers to the principles of conduct governing an individual or a group. Specifically, the standards are used to decide what your conduct should be. And making ethical decisions always involve two things. First, it always involves normative judgments, right? A normative judgment means that something is good or bad, or right or wrong, or better or worse. You are wearing a skirt and a blouse is a non-normative statement. That's a great outfit is a normative one. Second, ethical decisions always involve questions of morality. Now, morality is society's highest unaccepted standards of behavior. Moral standards guide behaviors of the most serious consequence to society's well-being, such as murder or lying or slander. And authoritative bodies like legislatures can't change what morality means. Moral judgments also trigger strong emotions. Now, furthermore, asking is what I'm doing legal won't necessarily reveal if it is ethical. Now, firing a 39-year-old employee with 20 years tenure without cause may be legal, but some would view it as unethical. Now, similarly, fairness is an issue in most human resource decisions. Fairness is inseparable from what most people think of as justice. A company that is just is, among other things, equitable, fair, impartial, and unbiased in how it does things. With respect to employee relations, experts generally define organizational justice in terms of at least two components. One is the distributive justice, and we have the procedural justice. And I've also included something known as interactional justice. So, distributive justice refers to the fairness and justice of the decision's result. So, for instance, did I get an equitable pay raise, right? That is a distributive justice. Procedural justice refers to the fairness of the process. So, for instance, is the process my company uses to allocate merit merit raises, is that fair, right? Is the process fair? And finally, interactional justice is the manner in which managers conduct their interpersonal dealings with the employees of the organization. Now, whether a person acts ethically at work is usually not a consequence of any one thing. So, for example, could it be that everyone running some of the banks that triggered the subprime mess was simply unethical? Possibly, but not likely. There must have been more to it. So, ethical behavior starts with moral awareness. In other words, does the person even recognize that a moral issue exists in the situation? And managers can do a lot to influence employee ethics by carefully cultivating the right norms, leadership, reward systems, and culture. The most powerful morality comes from within because people bring to their jobs their own ideas of what is morally right and wrong. The individual must shoulder much of the credit or the blame for ethical choices. So, for example, one survey of CEOs explored their intention to engage in soliciting a competitor's technological secrets and bribing foreign officials. Now, the researchers concluded that personal inclinations more strongly affected decisions than did environmental pressures or organizational characteristics. Now, managers do a lot to influence ethics. It's hard to resist even subtle pressure, let alone coercion from your boss. According to one report, for instance, the level of misconduct at work dropped dramatically when employees said their supervisors exhibited ethical behavior. And only 25% of employees who agreed that their supervisors set a good example of ethical business behavior said that they had observed misconduct in the last year, compared with 72% of those who did not feel that their supervisors set good examples. So here are some ways how supervisors knowingly or unknowingly can lead their subordinates astray. So one is sometimes this would be personal experience as well for some of you all. Where the managers tell the staffers to do whatever is necessary to achieve the results, right? Without so that's like indirectly saying by hook or by crook, just get it done. Second is to overload top performers to ensure that the work gets done. And sometimes you find managers look the other way when wrongdoing occurs. And some of them take credit for others' work or shift the blame. So these are things managers or the boss should try and not do, because a boss's influence goes a long way. Now, we can define organizational culture as the characteristic values, traditions, and behaviors a company's employees share. A value is a basic belief about what is right or wrong, or about what you should or shouldn't do. And honesty is the best policy would be a value. And values are important because they guide and channel behavior. So managing people and shaping their behavior therefore depends on shaping the values they use as behavioral guides. So the firm's culture should therefore send clean signals about what is and isn't acceptable behavior. So for example, if management really believes honesty is the best policy, the written rules they follow and the things they do should reflect this value. Now, managers therefore have to send the right signals to their employees. Guidelines include the following. Clarify expectations. First, make clear your expectations with respect to the values you think are critical. For example, if you take Johnson & Johnson's ethics code, what they say is we believe our first responsibility is to the doctors, nurses, and patients, to the mothers and fathers, and all others who use our products and services. That value is one to which the company expects all its employees to adhere. Then we have walk the talk. Employees take their signals from the boss's actions, like we had discussed some time back. Managers need to walk the talk. They can't say, don't fudge the financials and then go do it themselves. you need to provide physical support. The physical manifestations of the manager's values, the incentives, the appraisal criteria, and the disciplinary procedures he or she uses. For instance, send strong signals regarding what employees should and should not do. Do you reward ethical behavior or do you penalize it, right? So these are the kind of things you need to think about when you set up the environment. Then you use stories to illustrate values. Stories of, basically how the organization has gone about dealing with ethical issues in the past, and probably keep emphasizing on how important those values are through those stories, and elaborate how we need more stories of this sort even for the future. And another way to do it is also to organize rites and ceremonies in the organization, reinforcing these values, to remind the employees of these values, and to kind of inculcate them with these values. Now, the HR's role in creating culture. Many of the actions managers can take to promote ethics fall within the realm of human resource management practices. So, if you take the example of staffing and selection, one writer says the simplest way to tune up an organization, ethically speaking, is to hire more ethical people. And employers can start before the applicant even applies by creating recruitment materials that emphasize ethics. Now, if you go into the Microsoft site, they use tools such as honesty tests and background checks to screen out the undesirables. And they ask behavioral questions such as, have you ever observed someone stretching the rules at work, and what did you do about it? Managers interviewing applicants also need to make sure that the screening process is fair. So if prospective employees perceive that the hiring process does not treat people fairly, they may also assume that ethical behavior is not important. So applicants tend to view the formal procedure as fair to the extent that it tests job-related criteria and provides an opportunity to demonstrate competence. Applicants also expect respect, and interpersonal treatment reflects such things. So make sure you show that sort of politeness when you're assessing the employee, and make sure the two-way communication. Applicants see a selection system as fair to the extent that the employer provides useful feedback about the employee's or candidate's own performance. Another way HR can go about inculcating this is ethics training. So for all practical purposes, ethics training is mandatory. And US federal sentencing guidelines reduced penalties for employers accused of misconduct who implemented codes of conduct and ethics training. And an amendment to those guidelines now outlines stricter ethics training requirements. And ethics training usually includes showing employees how to recognize ethical dilemmas and how to use ethical frameworks. Also to resolve problems and how to use human resource activities in ethical ways. Now, ethical training is often internet-based. So, for example, Lockheed Martin's 160,000 employees also take ethics and legal compliance training via the firm's intranet. And Lockheed's online ethics program software also keeps track of how well the company and its employees are doing in terms of maintaining high ethical standards. Performance appraisals. How do you conduct appraisals is very important. And studies confirm that in practice, some managers ignore the accuracy in performance appraisals and instead use the process for political purposes. Now, few things can send a more damaging signal about how fair and ethical the company is. To send the signal that fairness is paramount, standards should be clear. Employees should understand the basis upon which you're going to appraise them, and the appraisal itself should be objective. Then we have the reward and disciplinary systems. To the extent that behavior is a function of its consequences, the manager needs to reward ethical behavior and penalize unethical behavior. And research suggests employees expect the organization to dole out relatively harsh punishment for unethical conduct. If the company does not deal swiftly with unethical behavior, often the ethical employees feel punished. Now, the basics of a fair and just disciplinary process. The employer wants its discipline process to be both effective and fair. And employers base such a process on three pillars: clear rules and regulations, a system of progressive penalties, and an appeals process. So, first, rules and regulations address issues such as theft, destruction of company property, drinking on the job, and insubordination. And examples include poor performance is not acceptable. Each employee is expected to perform his or her work properly and efficiently. Alcohol and drugs do not mix with work. The use of either during working hours and reporting for work under the influence of either or are both prohibited. And rules inform employees ahead of time what is and is not acceptable behavior. So upon hiring, tell employees, preferably in writing, what is not permitted. The employee handbook usually contains the rules and regulations. A system of progressive penalties is the second pillar of effective discipline. Penalties typically range from oral warnings to written warnings to suspension from the job to discharge. And the severity of the penalty is usually a function of the type of offense and the number of times it has occurred. So, for example, most companies issue warnings for the first unexcused lateness. And for a fourth offense, discharge is the usual disciplinary action. Now, formal disciplinary appeals processes. In addition to rules and progressive penalties, the disciplinary process requires an appeals procedure. The standing orders for industrial workers and service rules contain the procedure to be followed for an appeal. Usually, appeal is to be made to a higher authority rather than the disciplinary authority. In many traditional Indian firms in the private sector, the appeal system functions at the informal level, and more often, a paternalistic decision is awarded. Then we have something known as discipline without punishment. Traditional discipline has two potential drawbacks. First, no one likes to be punished. Second, punishment tends to gain short-term compliance, but not sort of long-term cooperation employers often prefer. So discipline without punishment aims to avoid these drawbacks. It does this by gaining employees' acceptance of the rules while reducing the punitive nature of the discipline itself. And here is how it works. First, issue an oral reminder. The goal is to get the employee to agree to avoid future infractions. Second, should another incident arise within 6 weeks, issue a formal written reminder, a copy of which is placed in the employee's personal file. In addition, hold a second private discussion with the employee, again without any threats. Give a paid one-day decision-making leave. If another incident occurs in the next 6 weeks or so, tell the employee to take a one-day leave with pay and to stay at home and consider whether the job is right for him or her, and whether he or she wants to abide by the company's rules. When the employee returns to work, he or she meets with you and gives you a decision regarding whether or not he or she will follow the rules. If no further incidents occur in the next year or so, purge the one-day paid suspension from the person's file. If the behavior reoccurs, typically the next step is dismissal. And the process would not apply in exceptional circumstances. Criminal behavior or in-plant fighting might be grounds for immediate dismissal. Now, employee privacy. Now, for most people, invasions of privacy are neither ethical nor fair. The four main types of employee privacy violations upheld by courts are intrusion, that is locker room and bathroom surveillance, publication of private matters, third, disclosure of medical records, and appropriation of an employee's name or likeness for commercial purposes. Employee monitoring today goes beyond listening in on phone lines. And biometrics using physical traits such as fingerprints or iris scans for identification is one example. So, with fingerprint technology, the user passes his or her fingertip over an optical reader or presses it onto a computer chip. Bronx Lebanon Hospital in New York uses biometric scanners to ensure that the employee who clocks in the morning is really who he or she says he is. And more than half of employers say they monitor their employees' incoming and outgoing email, and 27% monitor internal email as well. And one survey found that 41% of large employers have someone reading employee emails, and 96% block access to adult websites, and 61% block access to game sites. And location monitoring is becoming pervasive. As its name implies, this involves checking the location and movement of employees. And this sort of location monitoring is usually done with parcel service companies to monitor their truckers and street sweepers. Now, dismissal is the most drastic disciplinary step the employer can take. And because of this, it requires special care. There should be sufficient cause for the dismissal, and you should only dismiss someone after taking reasonable steps to rehabilitate or salvage the employee. However, there will undoubtedly be times when dismissal is required, perhaps at once. The best way to handle a dismissal is to avoid it in the first place, and many dismissals start with bad hiring decisions. Using effective selection practices, including assessment tests, reference and background checks, drug testing, and clearly defined job descriptions can reduce the need for many dismissals. Now, termination at will. For more than 100 years, termination at will was the prevailing dismissal-related rule in the United States. And termination at will means that without a contract, either the employer or the employee could terminate at will the employment relationship. And the employee can resign for any reason at will, and the employer can dismiss an employee for any reason at will. Now, today, however, dismissed employees are increasingly taking their cases to court, and many employers are discovering that they no longer have a blanket right to fire. The other sort of dismissal is known as wrongful discharge. Wrongful discharge refers to a dismissal that violates the law or that fails to comply with contractual arrangements stated or implied by the employer, for instance, in employee manuals. And three main protections against wrongful discharge have eroded the termination at will doctrine. One is statutory exceptions, second is common law exceptions, and third is public policy exceptions. So first, in terms of statutory exceptions, federal and state equal employment and workplace laws prohibit specific types of dismissals. As just one example, occupational safety laws prohibit firing employees for reporting dangerous workplace conditions. Second is the common law exception. For example, some state courts recognize the concept of implied contracts in employment. Thus, a court may decide that an employee handbook promising termination only for just cause may create an exception to the at-will rule. And finally, under the public policy exception, courts have held a discharge to be wrongful when it was against an explicit, well-established public policy. So, for instance, the employer fired the employee for refusing to break the law. Now, there are four bases for dismissal. One is unsatisfactory performance, misconduct, lack of qualification for the job, and change requirement of the job. And I've also added something known as insubordination, which I also consider is an important ground for dismissal. Now, unsatisfactory performance means persistent failure to perform assigned duties or to meet prescribed job standards. The specific grounds include excessive absenteeism, tardiness, a persistent failure to meet normal job requirements, or an adverse attitude towards the company, supervisor, or fellow employees. Misconduct is deliberate and willful violation of the employer's rules and may include stealing, rowdy behavior, and insubordination. And sometimes the misconduct is more serious, as when it causes someone else harm. Then we have lack of qualifications. Lack of qualifications for the job is an employee's inability to do the assigned work, although he or she is diligent. And if the employee may be trying to do the job, it is reasonable to do what's possible to salvage him or her. Perhaps what you could do is assign the person to another job. Now, change requirements of the job. This refers to an employee's inability to do the job after the employer changed the nature of the job. Now, again, the employee may be industrious, so it is reasonable to retrain or to transfer this person if possible. And insubordination is a form of misconduct and basically refers to disobedience or rebelliousness. And while things like stealing, chronic tardiness, and poor quality work are easily understood grounds for dismissal, insubordination is sometimes harder to translate into words. So if you take some examples of insubordination, one would be direct disregard for the boss's authority, or direct disobedience or refusal to obey the boss's orders, particularly in front of others, or public criticism of the boss, or maybe participation in an effort to undermine or remove the boss. So these are some of the examples of insubordination that happen in a workplace. Now, avoiding wrongful discharge suits. First, create employment policies, including grievance procedures, like those in this chapter that help make employees feel you treated them fairly. Similarly, employers can use severance pay to blunt a dismissal sting. There is no way to make the termination pleasant, but the first line of defense is to handle it justly. Second, review and refine all employment-related policies, procedures, and documents to limit challenges. Have applicants sign the employment application. Make sure it contains a statement that employment is for no fixed term and that the employer can terminate at any time. Pay particular attention to the employee handbook. It should include an acknowledgement form. And consider deleting statements such as employees can be terminated only for just cause. Keep careful, confidential records of all actions such as employee appraisals, warnings or notices, and memos outlining how improvement should be accomplished. And third but not the least, make sure you clearly communicate job expectations to the employee. Failing to do so triggers many wrongful termination suits. Now we've come to an end to the session on ethics, justice, and fair treatment in HR management. I hope you enjoyed this session. And in the next session, we would be discussing employee safety and health, which is part of the same unit. Thank you so much for listening in, and have a good day.